Okay then, so the next thing I want to add to this form are radio buttons, and that's going to offer the user a way to select a category. So I've already searched for the radio component right here on Material UI, and if we scroll down, this is what these radio buttons are going to look like. So we can see we have a disabled option right here, then some standard options. This is the code that they provide. We're going to do something similar to this later on, but to begin with, I want to show you the basic way to create a radio component. So the first thing to do, as always, is import the component we need. So import radio from Material UI Core Radio, and then down here, below the text fields, I'm just going to output a couple of radio components. So let me do this, radio, self-closing, and then we also give this a value, and basically we give this a value because ultimately when a user selects a radio button, we want to store the value of that radio button, whatever they've selected, somewhere. So that's what this is kind of used for. So the value is equal to hello in this case, and then let's do another one, and the value is going to be goodbye. Okay, so if I save this, then preview in the browser, then it's going to look something like this. We have two radio buttons. We don't see any text, but that's because we've not used labels at the minute. The value is not a label. The value is just a property on this radio button. If I inspect this and come over here, we can see we have an input right here, and the value is hello on this input. That's where the value goes, okay? All right then, so this thing right here is a radio button, this is a radio button, and they can both be selected. Now, in our case, I don't want a user to be allowed to select multiple radio buttons at once, because that kind of defeats the object of choosing a category. I don't want it to be in a work category, but also in a to-dos category, for example. I just want them to choose one single category, and this isn't allowing me to only let the user choose one. Now, the way we do this is by using a radio group. And a radio group is something that surrounds different radio buttons to group them together so that a user can only choose one of those options. Now, the radio group is a component, so I need to import it first of all at the top. So import radio group from /core/radio group. And then down here, what we can do is surround these things with the radio group component. So let me do that. I'm going to say radio group, and then at the bottom I'll place the closing tag like so and scoot those in. So if I save this now and preview, we can only select now one of these at a time because they're grouped together. And when we have a group of radio buttons, the idea is that a user should only be able to select one of those. Otherwise, we'd use checkboxes where they can select multiple different things. But radio buttons ideally should only be where a user selects one of them. So that solves this problem. Now, they do look a little bit different as well, and we get this massive oval hover effect, but don't worry, that's going to go later on. Now, we could use radio buttons like this, but instead there's a better way to use them, and that's to kind of embed them in what's known as a form control label. And this gives us a way to create a label which kind of wraps around the control, the radio button. So that's what I'm going to do. So right here, I'm going to delete those, and instead I'm going to use a component called form control label. If I click on this, it's going to auto import it at the top for me. You can see right here, it's grabbed it. It has destructured it, but it doesn't matter. It's still going to work. So down here, form control label. The first thing I'm going to do with this is give this a control property. Okay, so let me just close off this form control label. Now, this control property is basically the type of control that we want this label for. And in our case, it's going to be the radio component. So this is all we do. We place our radio component inside the form control label. But the good thing about this is that we can add now a label to this input. And this, for example, is going to be money. That would be a category, right? And if I save this and preview, now we can see it's styled nicely. We have the label on the right. However, it won't let me select anything at the minute. We'll come to that later on because this needs a value. And I'm going to set that equal to money. So basically, when a user selects or checks this radio button, this is the value that is associated with that radio button. And if we save this now and try to select, now it works. Okay, so it needs that value prop. All right, so that is a form control label. Now, ideally, we want a few of these because we have a few different categories. So the second one I'm going to do is going to be for to-dos, and then down here it's going to be reminders, and then below that it's going to be work. So we have 4 different categories, and we need to change the labels for each one of these as well. So let's do that. Work finally. And now if we save this, it should look all right. Cool. And each of these has a different value, and we can only select one at a time. Cool. So this is working, but we now want to store whatever value a user has selected in some kind of state, don't we? So let's create some more state for this. I'm going to go to the top, and below these, I'm going to say const, and we're going to call this category, and a function set category to change this. Set that equal to use state. Now, what we're going to do is set an initial value, and this initial value is going to be one of these values right here: money, to-dos, reminders, or work. And when we set that initial value, basically what we're going to do is pass it into this radio group later to say that, look, this initial value should be the one that's auto-checked when we first come on the page. So if I set this equal to, for example, to-dos, then I want it to be where a user first comes onto this create page, and this to-dos one is initially checked by default because that's the first value that we hard-coded, right? Okay, so how do we link up this value with the radio group? Well, I can say value first of all and set that equal to category. So that was the piece of state, and that's equal to to-dos, and that's what sets this as the default active radio. So if I refresh, it's always going to be to-dos when we refresh. Now, if I try to click on this, it's not going to let me change it anymore, and that's because this value now is always to-dos based on this category state. So we need a way to update that category whenever we select a different value, and we can do that by using the onChange handler. So we'll set this equal to a function which takes in the event object, and inside this function we're going to use setCategory to update the state, and we want to update it to the event.target. So that will be whatever radio button we select, and then the value of that. So that's either going to be money, to-dos, reminders, or work. So let me save this and preview in a browser. Now we can select any of these. Now what I want to do is output that value at the end. So let me output the category right here as well. Save it and preview over here. Let's go to the console so we can see this. Enter in any old rubbish and then change this to reminders, submit, and we can see now we get reminders right here as well as these other 2 things. Awesome. So there is one more thing I want to do, and that's to add a label to this section. So each one of these has a label, but I want a little label above this section to say, look, this should be the category you choose. So how am I going to do that? Well, in order to do this, the first thing we have to do is import a couple of things. So I'm importing 2 things. We have a form label right here. So this is a generic label that we can use to apply a label to different form sections, if you like. And then we have a form control, which is kind of like a wrapper for a certain section, a certain control area of the form. So what's going to happen is this form control is going to wrap a label with this section. So it associates the label with these things. So then, let me come down here and flesh this out. So above the radio group, first of all, I'm going to do the label. So form label like so. And by the way, we don't use the form control label here because this is a generic label. It's not going next to or wrapping a particular control. This is just to label a particular section of the form. So all we need to do right here is say note category, and that is our form label. Now, I want to associate this with this. I want to put it into the same context, if you like. And to do that, all we have to do is wrap everything inside a form control component, which is the other thing we just imported. So let me do that as well. Form control, like so. and then I'll put the closing tag at the very bottom down here and scoot these things in like so. Now I'm also going to apply a class to this, so class name is equal to classes.field, and that is the field class we created earlier right here, and all this does is apply some margin to this section of the form now. So if we save this and preview, we can see now we have this category and everything should hopefully still work. Let me choose one of these, enter in a load of rubbish, press submit, and yep, everything works. So the next step is to submit this form and store our data somewhere. And to do that, we'll be using JSON server. So we'll set that up in the next lesson.